have to call the EMI.
Okay.
Crime scene may have to be called. I don't know.
On a sweltering summer afternoon in Florida, deputies responded to what seemed like a routine welfare check. A mother worried because her son hadn't answered calls in days. Nothing about the call suggested what officers were about to walk into. The house was quiet, no response at the door, curtains drawn, mail piling up, just another silent home under the blazing heat. But the moment officers forced their way inside, everything changed. A smell hung in the air, thick, unmistakable, the kind officers never forget. The kind that signals something has gone terribly wrong. Room by room, deputies cleared the house, calling out, hoping someone would answer. Instead, they found something horrifying. A man dead inside his own home, his body decomposing. And worse, parts of him were missing. What first appeared to be a tragic death quickly unraveled into something far darker. A mystery involving a toxic relationship, violent history, conflicting alibis, and a suspect whose past may hide more than one deadly secret. And as investigators dug deeper, they began to ask a chilling question. Was this an isolated killing or part of a pattern? This is the disturbing case that deputies who responded say they will never forget. On July 28, 2017, deputies with the Daytona Beach Police Department were dispatched to a quiet neighborhood in Volusia County, Florida. The call itself was not unusual. Officers respond to welfare checks every day, concerned family members asking police to check on loved ones who haven't answered calls or messages, but something about this request felt different from the start. Jeffrey Albertsman's mother had grown increasingly worried. She hadn't heard from her son in over a week. Calls went unanswered. Text messages received no reply. His voicemail box was full, something his family said was unusual. At first, relatives tried to handle it themselves. Friends and neighbors were asked if they had seen him. Some people in the area said Jeffrey hadn't been around for days. Others said they heard arguments coming from his home roughly a week earlier. Eventually, fear overpowered uncertainty, and the family contacted police. When officers arrived at Jeffrey's home on North Street, several relatives were already gathered outside. The house appeared quiet. No lights, no movement, curtains drawn, a mailbox overflowing with mail. Deputies knocked repeatedly. No answer. They circled the house looking for any signs of activity, but the home remained silent. Eventually, the fire department was called to assist in forcing entry. As firefighters pried the door open, officers prepared to clear the residence, unsure what they might find inside. Standard protocol kicked in. Officers announced themselves as they entered. Police department, we're coming in. Inside, the house was dim. The air was thick and heavy. Officers moved slowly, checking each room, calling out in case Jeffrey was unconscious or injured somewhere inside. But as they moved further in, something became immediately apparent: the smell. Veteran officers recognized it instantly, the unmistakable odor of decomposition. Deputies continued clearing rooms, moving toward the back of the house. Then they reached the bathroom. And that's when everything changed. Body camera footage later released to the public blacks out the visual footage at this point, but the audio remains, and what officers say in those moments tells the story. One deputy is heard reacting in shock. Jesus. Another officer responds quietly, processing what they are seeing. Yeah, there's no way. Jeffrey Albertsman was found inside the bathroom, badly decomposed. The Florida heat had accelerated the condition of the body. Officers immediately realized he had been dead for quite some time, but even from the limited initial view, something appeared horribly wrong. At first glance, it looked like Jeffrey may have suffered some kind of injury, but it wasn't immediately clear what had happened. Officers backed out of the room and secured the scene. The medical examiner and crime scene investigators were immediately requested, and while deputies waited, officers outside faced one of the hardest parts of their job: telling the family. Jeffrey's loved ones, still waiting outside in the Florida heat, were informed that he had been found deceased inside the home. Officers tried to remain calm and professional, but the reality of the situation was devastating. Family members began crying as the truth sank in. Meanwhile, inside the home, investigators began documenting the scene. Once the medical examiner arrived and the body was examined more carefully, the situation became even more disturbing. Jeffrey had suffered a gunshot wound to the back of his head, and there was something even worse. Parts of his body were missing. His arms and legs had been removed after death. The discovery transformed the case from a welfare check into a full homicide investigation. Detectives immediately began piecing together what had happened in Jeffrey's final days. They needed to determine when he was last seen alive, who he had contact with, and whether anyone might have wanted to harm him. And almost immediately one name kept coming up: Jeffrey's girlfriend. Family members told officers Jeffrey had been involved in a long, troubled relationship with a woman named Neely Tetley. Their relationship had lasted nearly a decade, but according to relatives, it was filled with conflict. Jeffrey's stepfather spoke candidly with officers, revealing disturbing details about the couple's past. He told police that several years earlier, Neely had stabbed Jeffrey during an argument, sending him to the hospital. She had been arrested and served time for that incident. Despite that violent history, the two eventually reconciled and resumed their relationship, and according to neighbors, arguments between them were frequent. As investigators began gathering information, another troubling detail surfaced. A neighbor claimed they had seen Neely at Jeffrey's house just the day before his body was discovered. According to the witness, she arrived, checked the mailbox, and then went inside the house for roughly 15 minutes before leaving again. If Jeffrey had already been dead for days, why was she there? And why hadn't she contacted police if she suspected something was wrong? Detectives now had their first major lead, but at this stage, they still didn't know the full horror of what had happened, and they had no idea that Jeffrey's case might connect to another unsolved death from years earlier. That revelation would soon change everything. As investigators continued examining Jeffrey Albertsman's home, detectives began trying to reconstruct his final days. Based on the condition of the body, it was clear he had not died recently. Florida's intense summer heat speeds up decomposition, and investigators believed Jeffrey had likely been dead for at least a week before deputies forced entry into the home. The timeline now became critical. Detectives needed to determine who had last seen Jeffrey alive and who might have had access to him in those final days. Very quickly, attention turned to one person whose name kept coming up in conversations with family members and neighbors: Jeffrey's longtime girlfriend, Neely Tetley. Their relationship had lasted nearly a decade, but almost everyone who knew them described it as unstable and often volatile. Jeffrey's stepfather had already mentioned earlier incidents involving violence, so detectives pulled official court records to examine their past interactions more closely. What they found was troubling. In 2013, police were called after Jeffrey was stabbed during an argument with Neely. According to reports, Jeffrey had been trying to end the relationship and had checked into a hotel to get some distance. Neely allegedly kept calling and texting, asking to meet and talk things through. Eventually, Jeffrey agreed to meet her, but instead of reconciliation, the situation escalated. Police reports state that Neely Pepper sprayed Jeffrey and then stabbed him in the stomach with a kitchen knife. Jeffrey survived the attack, but required hospital treatment. Neely was arrested and later sentenced to probation. Despite the severity of that incident, the relationship somehow resumed months later. Friends described the couple as constantly breaking up and getting back together. Arguments were common, and neighbors often heard shouting coming from the home. Then in 2016, another incident occurred. Court records indicate that during another heated confrontation, Nellie allegedly told Jeffrey, "I could kill you tonight if I wanted." Police reports say she physically assaulted him during that argument as well. Once again, she received probation and fines, and again, the relationship continued. So when Jeffrey's body was discovered in July 2017, many people already suspected that the troubled relationship might have finally turned deadly. A neighbor provided detectives with information that quickly became important. She reported seeing Neely at Jeffrey's house just one day before deputies arrived for the welfare check. According to the witness, Neely pulled into the driveway during the afternoon, retrieved mail from the mailbox, and entered the home. The neighbor estimated she remained inside for about 15 minutes before leaving. At the time, the sighting didn't seem unusual. Neely had visited before, but with Jeffrey now found dead inside, detectives needed to know why she was there. If Jeffrey had already been dead for several days, what was Neely doing inside the house? Detectives soon contacted Neely for questioning. She admitted the relationship with Jeffrey had problems, describing it as bad, but she also claimed she helped him financially and tried to support him. She told investigators she hadn't heard from Jeffrey for more than a week before his body was found. According to her, she became worried and went to his home several times to check on him. She confirmed visiting the day before police discovered the body. However, she insisted she never entered the house because she didn't have keys. She claimed she smelled a foul odor, describing it as something like a dead animal, but said she couldn't get inside and eventually left. This statement immediately raised concerns for detectives. A neighbor had already told police she saw Neely enter the house, and if Neely was truly worried about Jeffrey and smelled something suspicious, why didn't she call police? Why not alert his family? Investigators then began verifying Neely's timeline. She provided locations where she said she had been during the days Jeffrey went missing, but cell phone data told a different story. Records placed her near Jeffrey's home at times she initially claimed she wasn't there. Video surveillance also contradicted parts of her account. Then detectives uncovered another problem. Neely eventually handed police a key, claiming it was the only one she possessed and that it didn't work on Jeffrey's home. But during a search of her apartment and vehicle, investigators found multiple keys. One unlocked Jeffrey's front door, another unlocked his car. So why claim she didn't have access? Detectives also interviewed neighbors near Neely's residence, and one statement stood out. A neighbor told police that roughly a week before Jeffrey's body was discovered, Neely made an odd comment. According to court documents, she said, "Jeffrey's gone. He went to New York. He has a new girlfriend. He's not coming back." At the time, it may have sounded like relationship gossip, but after Jeffrey was confirmed dead, the statement felt chilling. How did she know he wasn't coming back? By now, investigators had a growing list of concerning details. The couple had a violent history. There were previous threats and assaults. A witness placed Neely at the house shortly before the discovery. Her statements contained contradictions. She possessed keys giving her access to Jeffrey's home despite claiming otherwise, and her comments suggested Jeffrey was gone permanently. Still, detectives needed stronger evidence tying her directly to the killing itself, and another question loomed. Jeffrey's body had been dismembered, and parts of his remains were still missing. Where had they been taken? Months later, that answer would emerge. But in the process of searching for those missing remains, detectives would stumble onto something even more disturbing. A case from nearly 10 years earlier involving another missing man, another dismembered body, and once again, Neely Tetley connected to the victim. And investigators began wondering whether Jeffrey Albertsman was truly the only victim or simply the latest in a much darker pattern. Months passed after Jeffrey Albertsman's body was discovered, and investigators were still searching for the missing parts of his remains. Detectives believed whoever killed him had deliberately transported parts of his body away from the home, making the investigation far more complicated. Without locating those remains, reconstructing exactly what happened in Jeffrey's final moments would be even more difficult. Then, in September 2017, nearly 2 months after deputies first entered Jeffrey's home, investigators received an important call. Workers at a wooded area known as the Fernery, a state park roughly 45 minutes away from Jeffrey's house, discovered human remains. Authorities quickly responded, and forensic testing later confirmed those remains belonged to Jeffrey Albertsman. This discovery strengthened detectives' belief that Jeffrey's death was not accidental or impulsive. Someone had taken time to transport body parts, dump them in a remote wooded location, and attempt to hide evidence. Investigators now shifted their focus toward tracing movements connected to that area. One of the strongest tools they had was cell phone location data. When detectives reviewed Neely Tetley's phone records, they found something troubling. Her phone had been in the same area where Jeffrey's remains were later discovered, and this occurred during a time when she claimed she had been somewhere entirely different. According to investigators, Neely had told police she was in another town with Jeffrey cutting grass during that time, but phone data suggested otherwise. Her device traveled toward the park area where Jeffrey's remains were dumped. This inconsistency further damaged her credibility. By early 2018, detectives felt they had gathered enough evidence tying Neely to Jeffrey's death. She was arrested and charged with murder, but just when investigators believed they were closing in on justice, another disturbing connection surfaced. While reviewing Neely's past, detectives uncovered a cold case from nearly a decade earlier involving another missing man whose death bore striking similarities to Jeffrey's. That man's name was Michael Lewis. Michael Lewis disappeared in November 2007. About a month later, his remains were discovered in a state park in Ormond Beach, Florida, north of Daytona. Like Jeffrey, Michael's body had been dismembered, and Michael Lewis had also been romantically involved with Neely Tetley. Detectives reviewing the old case files noticed alarming parallels. Michael Lewis's remains had been scattered in a wooded area, similar to Jeffrey's case, and investigators at the time had also considered Neely a suspect, though she was never formally charged. Witness statements from that earlier investigation resurfaced. One witness told police that Neely showed up at a bar looking for Michael on the night he disappeared. According to the witness, Neely appeared angry and upset, allegedly saying something chilling. "I got to get rid of him. He is gone for good." At the time, the statement may have seemed like emotional frustration during a breakup, but when Michael's dismembered remains were later found, those words took on a darker meaning. Another witness from that case claimed to have received a call from someone watching Neely's apartment shortly after Michael went missing. The caller said they overheard Neely speaking with a man about a .38 caliber gun and mentioning that Michael had been shot. Still, despite suspicions, authorities never charged Neely with Michael Lewis's murder. The evidence at the time simply wasn't strong enough. But now, with Jeffrey Albertsman dead under eerily similar circumstances, detectives began reconsidering whether the two cases might be connected. Forensic experts were asked to examine similarities between the two dismemberment cases. According to court documents, specialists analyzed cut marks and the manner in which the bodies had been separated. Their conclusions were disturbing. Experts stated both victims showed sharp force injuries consistent with dismemberment using a manually powered tool, likely a knife. In both cases, attempts to separate body parts occurred at similar locations: elbows, hips, knees, and along the spine. The report concluded that an association between the two dismemberment cases could not be excluded. In other words, the same person could potentially be responsible for both killings. This revelation raised a frightening possibility. Jeffrey Albertsman may not have been the only victim connected to Neely Tetley. Despite these developments, prosecutors still faced a complicated path forward. The Jeffrey Albertsman case moved slowly through the court system, and soon another obstacle emerged: questions about Neely's mental competency. After her arrest in early 2018, Neely remained in custody, but court proceedings repeatedly stalled due to concerns about whether she was mentally fit to stand trial. In 2021, court records show she was evaluated and deemed competent, but less than a year later, another evaluation concluded the opposite. According to filings, Neely appeared confused, disoriented, and unable to properly understand court proceedings. Reports stated she sometimes behaved inappropriately in front of counsel and struggled to comprehend the legal process. As a result, court officials ordered further mental health evaluations, and she was transferred into treatment facilities for assessment and care. Her defense team pushed back at times, arguing against certain findings, which further delayed proceedings. By 2026, nearly 9 years after Jeffrey's death, the case remained unresolved. Neely Tetley, now in her mid-70s, remained in custody but had not yet gone to trial due to ongoing mental health concerns. Court records show she was eventually committed to a mental health facility, where she continues receiving treatment while awaiting further hearings. Meanwhile, the Michael Lewis case remains officially unsolved. Though investigators suspect a connection, no formal charges have ever been filed against Neely in that case. Her attorney has publicly denied any involvement in Michael Lewis's death, arguing that suspicions alone do not equal proof and that earlier investigations failed to produce sufficient evidence. Still, similarities between the two cases remain haunting. Two men, two relationships marked by conflict, two dismembered bodies found in wooded park areas, and one woman connected to both. Now, as time continues to pass, investigators and families alike are left waiting for resolution. Jeffrey Albertsman's loved ones are still seeking answers. Michael Lewis's family still lives with uncertainty, and as legal proceedings drag on, one haunting question remains: was Neely Tetley responsible for one tragic death, or two, and will the truth ever fully come out in court? As the years pass, the case surrounding Jeffrey Albertsman's death remains trapped in a complicated legal limbo. What began as a shocking discovery inside a quiet Florida home has evolved into a long, frustrating wait for justice, not only for Jeffrey's family but potentially for the loved ones of another man whose death still remains officially unsolved. After Neely Tetley's arrest in early 2018, many believed the legal process would move forward quickly. Investigators felt they had gathered strong circumstantial evidence. There was a history of violence in the relationship, contradictions in Neely's statements, phone records placing her in suspicious locations, and witnesses placing her at Jeffrey's home close to the time investigators believe he was killed. There were also the keys that contradicted her claims, the neighbors' comments about Jeffrey being gone for good, and the disturbing discovery of Jeffrey's dismembered remains miles away in a remote wooded area. But criminal cases are rarely simple, especially when mental health becomes a factor. Over time, court proceedings slowed as questions surfaced about Neely's competency to stand trial. Evaluations led to conflicting conclusions. At times, doctors determined she was mentally fit to proceed. At other points, assessments found she did not fully understand the legal process or could not properly assist in her defense. Court records describe moments when she appeared confused or disoriented. Some entries mention inappropriate behavior in court and difficulty grasping what was happening around her. As a result, hearings were postponed again and again while she underwent treatment and further evaluations. Meanwhile, Jeffrey Albertsman's family remained stuck in emotional uncertainty. They endured the trauma of discovering how Jeffrey died, learning the horrific details of his dismemberment, and waiting years without closure. Their grief has stretched far longer than anyone expected. And for investigators, there remains the uncomfortable possibility that Jeffrey may not have been the only victim connected to Neely Tetley. The similarities between Jeffrey's death and the earlier killing of Michael Lewis continue to haunt detectives. Michael disappeared nearly a decade earlier, his dismembered remains discovered in another Florida state park. He too had been romantically involved with Neely. Though authorities have long suspected a connection, the evidence was never strong enough to bring charges. Neely's attorney strongly denies any involvement in that case, emphasizing she was never formally accused or prosecuted. But forensic similarities between both cases leave lingering doubts. Experts noted similarities in how both bodies were dismembered, with cuts made in similar anatomical locations and signs suggesting the same type of manually operated tool may have been used. To investigators, the overlap is difficult to ignore. Yet suspicion alone cannot secure a conviction. Prosecutors must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and without direct evidence or witnesses linking Neely to Michael Lewis's death, that case remains officially unresolved. So today, nearly a decade after Jeffrey Albertsman was found dead inside his home, the case continues moving slowly through the court system. Neely Tetley, now in her mid-70s, remains in custody while receiving mental health treatment. Court records indicate she is currently committed to a mental health facility as doctors continue evaluating her ability to stand trial. A hearing remains scheduled, but whether she will ever face a full trial remains uncertain, and time continues to complicate matters. Memories fade, witnesses relocate, evidence becomes harder to present as years pass. Families grow older, still waiting for answers. For Jeffrey's loved ones, the nightmare began with a welfare check and the unimaginable discovery inside his home. For Michael Lewis's family, uncertainty has lasted nearly 20 years. 2 men lost their lives, 2 families continue to search for peace, and a case that once seemed headed toward resolution now sits suspended, its outcome unclear. The deputies who first entered that house on that hot summer afternoon could never have imagined the twists that would follow. The violent relationship history, the dismemberment, the possible connection to an earlier death, and the ongoing questions about whether justice will ever fully be served. For now, the story remains unfinished. The courts will eventually determine whether Neely Tetley will stand trial and whether a jury will hear the evidence in Jeffrey Albertsman's death. But until then, this case stands as a haunting reminder of how complicated justice can become when violence, history, and mental health collide. And sometimes, the most disturbing cases are not the ones solved quickly, but the ones that linger unanswered for years. If you found this breakdown informative and want more in-depth crime stories told in this cinematic format, make sure to like the video, share it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss upcoming cases.